Have you ever wondered why someone who once acted so close, so interested, and so emotionally present suddenly becomes distant, as if nothing ever mattered? And even more confusing, why do they sometimes come back after disappearing, acting like the connection never fully died in the first place? If you have experienced this, you already know the feeling is not just heartbreak. It is confusion mixed with hope, silence mixed with overthinking, and distance mixed with emotional attachment that refuses to disappear. There is something deeply powerful and often misunderstood about people who pull away like this. On the surface, it looks like they stopped caring. It looks like they moved on easily. It looks like they chose life without you. But human psychology is rarely that simple. What looks like not caring is often something very different inside the mind. It can be emotional overload. It can be fear of closeness. It can be an internal system that shuts down when feelings become too intense. And when you understand this, you stop taking it as a simple story of rejection and start seeing it as a pattern of emotional protection. The truth is, some people don't leave because they feel nothing. They leave because they feel too much in a way they don't know how to handle. When emotional intimacy becomes strong, their mind does not always register it as comfort. Instead, it registers it as pressure. Not because you did something wrong, but because their internal wiring connects closeness with loss of control. And when a human being feels like they are losing control of their emotional space, their instinct is not always to communicate. Sometimes the instinct is to escape. And this is where the real misunderstanding begins, because the person on the receiving end starts to think if they cared, they would stay. But what if the very intensity of caring is what made them leave in the first place? What if their system is built in a way where love feels real, but also feels overwhelming at the same time? This is where emotional conflict begins. One part of them feels attachment, warmth, and connection. Another part feels fear, pressure, and the need to breathe again. And when these two forces collide, distance becomes their temporary solution. But here is what most people never realize in the beginning. Distance does not always mean detachment. Sometimes distance is just regulation, a way for the mind to calm down, a way to regain emotional balance, a way to step back from feelings that feel too big to sit with. And during that distance, the other person is left trying to make sense of silence, often assuming it means the end. But silence in this pattern is not always an ending. Sometimes it is just a pause that the other person themselves does not fully understand. And this is exactly where the emotional cycle begins to form, because when someone pulls away, it creates a gap. And that gap does not only exist in physical communication, it starts to exist in memory, in emotion, in reflection. The mind does something very interesting here. It does not forget the emotional bond easily. In fact, absence often strengthens memory. The more something is missing, the more the mind starts to revisit it. Not immediately, not loudly, but slowly and quietly over time. This is why people often find themselves stuck in confusion, thinking about messages that stopped, conversations that ended abruptly, and feelings that were never fully explained. The brain searches for closure, but closure does not always arrive in a clean way. Instead, it arrives in stages. First comes shock, then comes confusion, then comes reflection, and somewhere inside reflection, attachment still remains alive, even if the connection has physically faded. And now, here is where this becomes even more important to understand, because this pattern does not always end with distance. Sometimes it leads to something unexpected, a return, a reappearance, a message out of nowhere, a small sign that the connection is not fully gone. And when that happens, it can feel like everything resets emotionally in an instant. Hope comes back. Questions come back, feelings come back. But without understanding the psychology behind it, this return can become even more confusing than the separation itself. That is exactly why it is so important to understand the deeper stages behind this behavior, because what looks random is often not random at all. There is a psychological rhythm to how emotional distance and return work in certain attachment patterns. And once you understand this rhythm, you stop feeling powerless in the situation. You stop interpreting every action as chaos, and instead, you start seeing the structure behind it. Stay with this, because what you are about to understand next will completely change how you interpret emotional distance, silence, and return. By the end of this video, you will not just understand why they leave and come back. You will also understand what actually makes someone stay for good, and why most connections fail before they ever reach emotional stability. The deeper reality behind this emotional pattern begins with something most people never notice in real time. When someone who is naturally avoidant starts to feel a strong emotional bond, their nervous system does not experience it the same way a secure person might. Instead of feeling stable connection, their internal world starts to register intensity, and intensity, for them, is not always interpreted as love. It is interpreted as risk. Not because the bond is unhealthy, but because their internal conditioning associates emotional depth with a loss of independence, loss of space, and eventually loss of self-control. This is where the hidden cycle quietly begins. At first, everything feels normal. There is interest, attention, even excitement. But as emotional closeness builds, their awareness shifts. They start to notice small internal signals that most people would ignore. A slight feeling of being overwhelmed, a subtle urge to withdraw, a growing need for distance that they cannot fully explain in logical terms. It is not a decision made with clarity. It is an emotional reflex that starts forming beneath awareness before it ever becomes visible in behavior. What makes this stage so confusing is that they are not fully rejecting the connection in their mind. They are actually divided inside themselves. One side feels comfort, attachment, and genuine appreciation for the bond. The other side feels pressure, responsibility, and emotional saturation. And because both sides exist at the same time, their behavior starts to shift in inconsistent ways. They may still care deeply, but their actions begin to show withdrawal patterns that contradict their feelings. This contradiction creates an internal tension that becomes harder to manage over time. The more meaningful the connection becomes, the more they feel the need to create space from it, not to destroy it, but to regulate themselves. In their perception, stepping back is not an act of abandonment. It is an act of emotional self-preservation. They are not always thinking about the consequences on the other person. Their focus is primarily internal, centered around regaining a sense of emotional equilibrium. As this distancing continues, something important happens that is often misunderstood. The emotional bond does not simply disappear from their system, it gets stored, not in active awareness, but in the background of memory. Human psychology is structured in a way that emotionally significant experiences do not erase easily. Instead, they remain embedded, waiting for triggers that bring them back into conscious thought. And in avoidant patterns, this delayed emotional processing is extremely common. After the separation or silence begins, their nervous system initially experiences relief. There is a sense of breathing space, a reduction in internal pressure, and a temporary feeling of control. But this state does not last in the same emotional form. Once the mind adjusts to the absence of stimulation, memory starts to activate again. And what returns is not usually the stress that caused the withdrawal. It is the positive emotional imprint that remains underneath it. This is where the second phase of the cycle slowly develops. The mind begins to revisit moments that felt safe, understood, and emotionally warm, but it does not happen in a structured or logical sequence. It comes in fragments, a familiar feeling during a quiet moment, a sudden recollection of a conversation, an emotional echo triggered by something unrelated in daily life. These fragments slowly rebuild internal awareness of the bond that was previously pushed away. At this stage, the person is no longer in the same emotional state they were during withdrawal. Now they are experiencing reflection without immediate pressure, and reflection has a different emotional tone. It softens memory, it removes intensity from past discomfort, and allows space for appreciation to grow again. This is why their perception of the connection can shift over time, even if nothing external has changed. However, this does not automatically lead to clarity or commitment, because alongside memory and reflection, fear is still present in the background. The same system that caused withdrawal in the first place does not disappear instantly. So when thoughts of reconnecting arise, they are often followed by hesitation. A push and pull dynamic begins internally. One part moves toward reconnection, while another part warns against emotional overload. This internal conflict is what creates unpredictable behavior patterns later on. They may feel drawn to reach out, but pause before acting. They may check in indirectly, but avoid full emotional engagement. They may reopen a small channel of communication, but keep it limited. Each step forward is balanced by an immediate step back, not because of lack of interest, but because trust in emotional stability is still being rebuilt internally. Understanding this stage is important because it reveals something essential. The return does not start with action, it starts with thought. And thought in this phase is not stable. It is fluctuating between memory and self-protection. That is why their behavior can appear inconsistent or unclear. It is not a strategy. It is an internal negotiation that is still unresolved. When this pattern is seen without understanding, it often leads to misinterpretation. The return is taken as certainty when it is actually exploration. Interest is mistaken for readiness when it is actually curiosity mixed with caution. And communication is seen as commitment when it is often just testing emotional safety. This is why the next stage becomes so critical, because what happens after this internal conflict determines whether the cycle repeats again or begins to stabilize into something more consistent. The third stage begins when inner resistance starts to lose its grip, but not in a sudden or dramatic way. It happens slowly, almost quietly, as if emotional distance and emotional curiosity begin to overlap instead of opposing each other. At this point, the mind is no longer fully focused on escape, nor fully committed to reconnection. It exists in a middle space where both safety and attachment are being evaluated at the same time. This is the most delicate phase in the entire cycle because behavior starts to shift in ways that are subtle but meaningful. In this stage, thoughts of the connection no longer feel like a threat. They start to feel familiar again. Familiarity is powerful in human psychology. It reduces fear over time. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable when enough emotional distance has passed. The nervous system, which earlier reacted with tension, begins to soften its response. This is not because the fear is gone completely, but because it is no longer at its peak intensity. Emotional memory begins to feel more accessible than emotional defense. As this internal shift develops, action slowly follows thought, but it does not appear in a fully committed form. Instead, it shows itself through indirect behavior. A small interaction, a brief message, a moment of attention that seems casual on the surface, but carries deeper meaning underneath. These actions are not random. They are attempts to test emotional conditions without fully exposing vulnerability. The goal is not to rush back into closeness, but to observe whether closeness still feels safe. What is happening here is a form of emotional experimentation. The mind is checking for stability. It is asking unspoken questions through behavior. Will things feel controlled or overwhelming again? Will expectations rise too quickly? Will personal space still exist inside the connection? These internal questions are not verbalized, but they guide every small step taken during this phase. As responses are observed, interpretation begins to form. If the emotional environment feels calm, non-pressuring, and steady, the internal system starts to relax further. If it feels intense or demanding, the system reacts by pulling back again. This is why the outcome of this stage is highly dependent on emotional tone rather than words alone. The feeling created in each interaction matters more than the interaction itself. At the same time, another important shift begins to take place. The emotional image of the connection becomes more balanced. Earlier stages often carry extremes. Either emotional closeness feels too strong or emotional absence feels too empty. But in this stage, perception starts to stabilize. The mind begins to hold both appreciation and caution together without immediate rejection of either. This balance is what allows gradual re-engagement to become possible. However, this does not mean full trust is established yet. Trust in this context is not about believing everything will be perfect. It is about believing that emotional pressure will not return at the same intensity. And this belief is built through repeated experiences of consistency. One interaction is never enough. It is the pattern of interactions that slowly rebuilds internal security. During this time, emotional memory also becomes more selective. The mind naturally starts to emphasize moments that felt calm and meaningful, while minimizing moments that felt overwhelming. This is not denial. It is how emotional regulation works when the brain tries to make sense of past experiences without triggering old defense mechanisms again. Positive associations become more accessible because they support reconnection without activating fear. Yet, even with this softening, hesitation does not disappear completely. It continues to exist in the background as a protective layer. This is why behavior can still appear inconsistent. There may be progress followed by pause, interest followed by silence, engagement followed by distance. These fluctuations are not signs of manipulation or lack of sincerity. They are signs that the internal system is still adjusting its definition of emotional safety. What is often misunderstood at this stage is the difference between emotional availability and emotional readiness. Availability means there is interest and openness present. Readiness means there is confidence that the emotional environment will remain stable over time. In this phase, availability is increasing faster than readiness. That gap creates the push and pull dynamic that confuses many people observing from the outside. As time continues, the deciding factor becomes emotional experience rather than emotional intention. The system learns through repetition. If interactions repeatedly feel safe, the need for withdrawal gradually weakens. If interactions repeatedly feel intense or uncertain, the need for distance returns. This learning process is slow, but it is consistent. It shapes whether the connection moves toward stability or cycles back into separation. Eventually, a tipping point is reached. Either the emotional environment becomes predictable enough for long-term engagement, or the internal system decides that distance is still the safer option. This is where outcomes diverge. Some connections stabilize because emotional pressure is reduced and consistency is maintained. Others collapse back into separation because old patterns are reactivated before trust is fully rebuilt. What makes this stage so important is that it holds the potential for permanence. Not because emotions suddenly change, but because emotional regulation becomes possible without fear dominating every decision. When closeness no longer feels like a loss of control, staying becomes a natural choice rather than a forced one. This is the final direction the cycle moves toward. The question is no longer about whether they return. The real question becomes whether the environment they return to allows them to remain without internal resistance building again. At this point in the cycle, something subtle but extremely important begins to define everything that follows. It is no longer about emotional intensity or sudden shifts. It becomes about stability over time. The mind, which once reacted strongly to closeness, starts to evaluate consistency as the main source of comfort. This is where long-term outcomes are shaped, not by dramatic actions, but by repeated emotional experiences that either reinforce safety or rebuild distance again. When someone with this attachment pattern reaches this stage, their behavior is guided less by emotion spikes and more by internal monitoring. They are not reacting to single moments anymore. They are observing patterns. Small details begin to matter more than big expressions. The tone of interaction, the level of expectation, the presence or absence of pressure. These elements silently influence whether the emotional system relaxes or tightens again. One of the most important shifts here is the need for emotional predictability. Uncertainty is what originally triggered withdrawal. So now, predictability becomes the foundation of comfort. This does not mean excitement is unwanted. It means emotional extremes are no longer appealing in the same way. The system starts to favor steady experiences that do not activate defensive responses. Calmness becomes more valuable than intensity. However, this does not happen in a straight line. There are still moments where old reactions appear. A sudden feeling of distance can return. A brief urge to disconnect may reemerge. But the difference now is that these reactions are shorter in duration. They do not fully take control the way they used to. Instead, they pass through like temporary signals rather than long-term decisions. This indicates that emotional regulation is slowly improving. During this phase, trust is no longer built through promises or explanations. It is built through repetition. Every consistent interaction adds a small layer of emotional reassurance. Every stable response reduces internal tension. Over time, these layers accumulate and form a sense of reliability. And reliability is what allows guarded emotional systems to lower their defenses without feeling exposed. Another key element in this stage is the reduction of internal conflict. Earlier phases were defined by opposing emotional forces, one side wanting closeness, the other resisting it. In this stage, those forces begin to align more often. The conflict does not disappear entirely, but it becomes less dominant. Instead of constant push and pull, there are longer periods of emotional neutrality where engagement feels less threatening. What often goes unnoticed is how much past emotional memory still influences present reactions. Even when things feel stable, the mind continues to compare current experiences with previous ones. If past closeness felt overwhelming, the system remains sensitive to signs of repetition. This is why even small increases in emotional demand can temporarily reactivate hesitation. The system is still learning that the present is different from the past. As stability continues, something very important begins to form in the background. Emotional association starts to shift. The connection is no longer primarily linked to pressure or escape. It starts to be linked with comfort and familiarity. This shift is gradual, but it is powerful. It changes how the mind categorizes the entire experience of the relationship. Instead of seeing it as something that requires protection from, it starts to see it as something that can be experienced safely. At this point, communication also becomes more natural. It no longer feels like a test or a risk. It becomes more integrated into daily emotional rhythm. There is less hesitation before engaging and less withdrawal after engagement. The need to overanalyze every interaction decreases. Emotional energy is no longer spent on constant self-protection, which allows more space for genuine connection to develop. Still, one crucial factor determines whether this stage leads to permanence or another cycle of distancing. It is the presence of emotional pressure. If expectations remain high or if urgency is introduced too frequently, the system can quickly revert to old defense patterns. Even after progress, the nervous system remembers intensity, and anything that resembles previous emotional overload can trigger a protective response again. On the other hand, when the environment remains steady and non-demanding, the system begins to rewire itself gradually. Emotional closeness starts to feel less like a threat and more like a stable experience. This is not an instant transformation. It is a slow conditioning process where repeated safety replaces repeated fear. Over time, the need to withdraw decreases because there is no longer a strong internal signal pushing for escape. Eventually, a point is reached where engagement no longer requires internal negotiation. The mind is not constantly deciding between staying and leaving. Instead, it settles into presence without excessive resistance. This is not emotional perfection. It is emotional tolerance reaching a level where connection can exist without triggering defensive behavior. What makes this final outcome possible is not control or persuasion, but emotional consistency over time. The system does not respond to intensity, it responds to repetition, it learns through experience, not explanation. And when enough experiences confirm that closeness is safe, the original pattern that caused withdrawal begins to lose its influence. At its core, this entire journey is not about chasing someone back or forcing attachment. It is about understanding how emotional systems respond to safety, pressure, memory, and time. When these elements are understood clearly, confusion is replaced with clarity, and what once felt unpredictable starts to make psychological sense.